Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and welcome to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and today I am delighted to welcome Richard Abels. Professor Abels is a Professor Emeritus of History at the United States Naval Academy, where he taught from 1982 until his retirement in 2017, and served as chair of the History Department from 2008 to 2014. He received his PhD from Columbia University in 1982 and specializes in the military and political institutions of Anglo-Saxon England and medieval warfare. His major works include Lordship and Military Obligation in Anglo-Saxon England from 1988, Alfred the Great, War, Kingship and Culture in Anglo-Saxon England, 1998, and Æthelred the Unready, The Failed King, 2018. A fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Medieval Academy of America, Abels has shaped the field through his culturally informed approach to medieval military history. And Richard, I am delighted to welcome you to Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be on your podcast. It's medievalists believe in reciprocity.
That
This
is
is
true.
the ethos of reciprocity, and I have been so grateful to have you as a guest on my podcast, Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages. We did 4 episodes together on, of all things, medieval adultery.
We did medieval adultery and literature. And in fact, I was going to mention your podcast, but of course your bio didn't quite get into that. And I was going to say, Tis But a Scratch is, of course, a wonderful, wide-ranging podcast that you do. And you just hit, what was it, your 100th episode? No, 100
Oh,
views?
no, I will be posting my 75th,
75th.
but what really pleased me is that I was told by Buzzsprout, my host, that I have now 50,000 downloads, and I was told by Peter Konetsky from medievalist.net, who's posting it on YouTube, that on YouTube I have 52,000, so I have over 100,000 downloads,
That's
which is
amazing.
really amazes me, given that this is a podcast about medieval history
Medieval history and literature and
and
adultery.
literature.
And we did discuss medieval sex a little bit.
Yes, and that might explain the 100,000 downloads.
I mean, I don't have 100,000 downloads, but that's okay because I just got started. But I do appreciate all the time that you had me on your podcast. It is such a fun experience to do that podcast
Podcasting
with
is
you.
fun. It's
Yeah.
fun. And it's the way I looked at it, there are many things I do not miss in retirement. I don't miss academic departmental meetings. I don't miss the lots and lots of administrative work that I had to do as chair and just as a faculty member. Um, and God knows, I do not miss grading, but I do miss teaching.
Right.
And podcasting is a way of teaching without having to do grading and without the constraints that you often have in a classroom.
That is
So,
true. So, and I mean, and to that point, I mean, you are an active scholar still. You are still doing research. You are still actively involved at conferences and obviously with the podcast because, the podcast, you've got to keep your own research current, your own interest current to keep going, but also to talk to other people as knowledgeably as you do. So, because of course, not only are you a military historian, you are also one of the people who first came to the first medieval conference that Stephen Isaacs and I did at Longwood University as one of our
yes.
plenary speakers with David Johnson. And I remember you gave an extraordinary paper on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the culture of military knighthood as preparation, the idea of hunting as preparation for knighthood for young men. So you've also given a really fascinating paper, and you wrote an article in 2008 about the culture of medieval warfare.
Yes.
So can you go ahead and kind of give for our viewers an introduction into the idea of medieval warfare and the culture of medieval warfare? Because so many
Okay.
people have so many misconceptions.
Well, we can start with the misconceptions about chivalry.
Oh, yes, please,
And
please, please.
yeah, okay. Let me start off actually with military history in general and approaches to military history. And I'll start off with a question that I asked on a final exam in my medieval military history course. It was war in the Middle Ages. And this is the question that I asked. There are at least two ways of understanding the history of war. The first is a scientific model of war that emphasizes unchanging principles of strategic conduct and inherent military probability. According to this model, regardless of the era or society, war is a rational endeavor carried out according to tactical and strategic pragmatic necessities and directed at achieving the goal of a state. This approach also puts a priority on the material factors in war, in particular technological determinacy, and tests what the historical sources claim to have happened against what we know to be physiologically or technologically possible, or in some cases, militarily sensible. If the details recorded in even an authentic primary source fail this test or stretch credibility, then they are to be rejected and material reality upheld. That's one.
Wait, are you saying that in Song of Roland, when they cut through a knight all the way through to the horse and then shear them completely in half, that's not true?
It is true. It is absolutely. They had very sharp swords back then.
They're not that sharp. I asked Bob Wisdom Savage, and he said no.
Okay, here is the other alternative. Others contend that war is a cultural activity. The reasons why societies engage in war and the method by which they fight them are defined by the particular norms, values, institutions, and mentalities of a society passed on from one generation to the next, which is pretty much the definition of culture. What we call the unchanging principles of war are themselves a cultural construct derived from a particular approach to war and a particular organization of the state characteristic of the West from the late 18th century to the present. We may call this the culturalist approach. So here's the question. Assess the influence of culture, political policy, technology, and practical military necessity upon why and how wars were fought in the Middle Ages. Which of the above interpretations do you find is more correct and why? You need not answer this as an either or. In the wars that you analyze, you may find elements of each to be true. Now, that last statement was really what I feel about this whole thing is that basically war is a combination. It's a combination of cultural, and it's a combination of technological, and a combination of practicality. That on one hand, there are reasons why war fought, which tend to be cultural reasons. And in this case, cultural would include economic reasons why was fought. Uh, or it could be something about honor, which may not be something that most modern wars are fought about, but is a reason for warfare. Or it can be religion,
Right.
which was why wars had been fought and why wars continue to be fought. So, in terms of the reason for war, for the justification of war, I would say that cultural considerations are very, very central. In terms of how the wars are fought, it's a combination. For one thing, people don't like to get killed,
Generally
and they
speaking,
will
no.
tend to do things on the battlefield in warfare which they might not want to do, which might not to them be considered honorable, but in the moment they will consider to be necessary so that they can stay alive for another moment.
Right.
In that case, what we have is a very practical reason for some tactical decisions which may violate the norms of a particular society and period.
Well, it's interesting though when you look at the history of warfare, and of course, having studied that trajectory, there's always strategy. There are tactics, which is the short term, strategy, which is the long term, the development of ideas and ethos of war. I mean, the art of war is that specifically. I mean, my father, as a former member of the military in the Navy and having gone to the War College, I mean, they can track how people saw their engagement in warfare for centuries. And yet a
Yes.
lot of people seem to think that this was haphazard or just a case of, barbarian armies clashing because no good reason. And yet, especially in the Middle Ages, war was fought with rules, but not the same kind of rules of chivalry, correct?
No, not the same kind of rules. And it's a really important thing to understand. First of all, I've given a very general definition of culture. There isn't one culture in any society in any time. You talk about American culture, it's American cultures, depending
Plural.
where you are, depending what community you belong to. At the US Naval Academy, I taught there for 35 years, and there are multiple cultures at the Naval Academy. There's an official culture. The official culture is what you get in the recruitment propaganda for the Naval Academy.
Yeah,
In those pamphlets, in any of the little videos that they produce to attract students to come to the Naval Academy, and in the handbooks and in the rules and regulations of what a model midshipman is. Then you get into the hall, and each company has its own culture. And the cultures are not necessarily the same
no,
in from company to company. Cultures also change if one belongs to a athletic team or if one has some kind of extracurricular activity like a debate, like in debate or something. They all have their particular cultures, and that extends to the various um, warfare communities in the Navy. There is definitely a different culture in the nuclear power community from, for example, the Marine Corps or from aviation.
absolutely.
Believe me, we're grateful that there's a different culture with the nuke power community.
Yeah. I mean, I have friends who are former Navy submariners. And of course, their approach to their military service and their Navy service in subs is very different than my father, who was a naval aviator. I mean, and also my father was a naval aviator in the 60s through the 80s. And that has changed exponentially as well as the technology of warfare has changed.
Yes.
And so, do we see that kind of multi-varied cultural aspect in medieval warfare as well? I mean, because people assume that medieval warfare was one thing, and yet,
Okay, let me just give a big overview.
please.
If you were looking at works on medieval warfare written in the 19th century and the early 20th century, probably the greatest of these historians was a man by the name of Oman and Charles Oman, Sir Charles Oman. And Charles Oman's idea of warfare was that warfare in the Middle Ages was about battles. And it was about battles which featured men heavily armored on horseback, which he called feudal warfare. Now, the thing that puzzled Oman about this was how few battles there actually were in the period that he was studying. If he were looking at Rome, Rome is filled with battles. Roman history is filled with battles. You're looking at the early modern period is filled with battles. You're looking at the period of the Middle Ages, especially the High Middle Ages, from let's say from the year 1000 to about the year 1450, and there are relatively few general engagements. And that became a real problem for Oman. How can he explain this? Well, he explained it by the idea that medieval warfare was amateur hour, that all of these guys were thought of themselves as warriors. They thought of themselves as these brave men on horseback, ready to engage, to fight to the death. The problem was they had no idea where any other army was, and they were wandering about looking for other armies, often not being able to find them. and then occasionally finding them, having a big battle. And it was sort of strategic,
Haphazard.
strategic nonsense.
Right.
And this was his explanation for this. He also, however, noticed that while there were very few battles, there were a hell of a lot of sieges.
Right.
And he really couldn't quite figure out why there were so many sieges, so few battles, except that you can always know where a castle and you can always know where a fortified town is.
You can find it. It's pretty obvious where there's a fortified castle, a fortified town, and that is rather the point of a castle.
Then in the 1970s, and this was a gradual thing, it's not really just automatic. There was a series of historians who started to look at medieval warfare and see that medieval warfare was not quite as amateurish as Oman posited. For Oman, warfare became more professionalized, and he was a Brit, therefore it has to be an Englishman who does it. And so it's Edward the First who starts to rationalize warfare, and then it becomes really rational when the English introduce their longbowmen, and then you have foot soldiers, and it all culminates with the Swiss and their pikemen and everything like that. For Oman, that's where warfare becomes the way that it's supposed to be. But other historians started to take a look. People like Michael Prestwich started to take a look at warfare, and especially John Gillingham. And John
Yes.
Gillingham came to what I thought was this eureka moment when he realized by just reading the sources and studying the man who ought to have been the exemplar of the heroic ideal of medieval warfare, Richard the Lionheart, Richard the First of England. And what he discovered is that the Lionheart probably should have been called Richard the Quartermaster, because Richard was more concerned with logistics than he was with tactics. That Richard, instead of engaging in battle willy nilly in his entire career, and he basically engaged in warfare for his entire adult life,
Right.
Richard fought maybe at the most four battles, at the
Right.
most. What was he doing? He was engaged in sieges, and he was a master of sieges, and he was engaged in ravaging. This is
And
what Richard was doing.
yes, and one of the things about Richard the First, I would say Richard the Lionheart. Of course, the way that he is portrayed in modern popular culture far outweighs any actual contemporary commentary about his prowess as king, because he was king for 20 minutes. Okay, he was king for 10 years, but he was king for 10 years of a country that he literally was in for 6 months. I mean,
Yes,
in the time that he was king of England, Richard the Lionheart set foot in England for 6 months, and that was it. And there's no real sense that he might have spent more time if he hadn't had that disastrous siege of Chalus for something that didn't exist, and gets killed rather stupidly and dies of septicemia. Um, but you have contemporary accounts of him as a military leader, and you have contemporary accounts of him for the Third Crusade from both the Muslim forces and the Muslim commanders, as well as his own words. And one of the most, I guess, memorable events of his career is the siege of Acre. Well, it's the siege of Acre. It's and there was battles too, but
yes.
it was pretty much the siege that made his name, because that's what he was doing. Lots and lots of long sieges. So can you explain the difference between the siege warfare and the battlefield warfare?
Okay. Siege warfare, the term siege itself comes from the word to sit. And that's what siege warfare is. It's sitting outside of a castle or a fortified town and usually starving it into submission. You can try to take the town by storm. You could try to take the castle by storm. And that's why you have siege engines. That's why you have catapults. And that's why you have the nuclear weapon of the High Middle Ages, the counterweight trebuchet. But often it doesn't work. and things like sapping, which is literally undermining a wall,
Right. So it's
which is
like,
another way of doing it. Sometimes doesn't work. And often what you end up having to do is just simply blockade the city and wait until they starve.
right,
This is the way that for example, uh, Henry V took the city of Rouen by starving it into submission. It tells you something about in that siege that the defenders of the city, who were professional mercenaries, the way that they dealt with this was by forcing all of the women and children who couldn't fight out of the city so they wouldn't have to feed them. And the way that Henry V responded to that was by not permitting them to go through his lines. And so you had civilians, women and children, in the ditch around Rouen, literally starving to death. What Henry was willing to do was allow newborn babies to be brought up to get baptized. Now, the reason he didn't let them through the lines was to destroy the morale of the defenders.
right.
It's cruelty and it's performative cruelty, but it has a military purpose. But it tells you something about the garrison itself, who had control over the city, that they had no compunction about sending these people out.
Right. And they weren't concerned about what happened to them if they did.
It's because they were the common people. They had no military purpose.
Or
They were a
value.
drag on it.
Right. Now,
Now,
this is, sorry, go ahead.
now, now, in the case of Richard, I just want to go a little bit further. Richard and Philip Augustus together take the city of Acre. Richard becomes dreadfully ill, but he continues to fight. And Philip Augustus, once Acre is taken, decides I fulfilled my vows. I can go back and create mischief back home and deal with bad Prince John of Robin Hood fame and make life miserable for Richard back in Normandy. So Philip goes off, and Richard's now basically in control of the crusade. The first thing he has is a problem. He has about 3,000 Saracen prisoners, and
Muslim
he
prisoners.
wants to march down to Jaffa. He wants to march down the coast and retake cities along the way and get to Jaffa, main port city. It's a 81-mile march, and he can't leave Acre behind with all those prisoners. And
He doesn't.
Saladin, who has agreed to rescue them, is delaying paying.
Right.
So what does Richard do?
He kills them.
He kills them.
And he does. I mean, I have read his letters justifying the slaughter at Accra. And I will pause because, well, not pause. I will simply say Saracen, especially as a literary term, is a complete construction. It's a fake term. It doesn't mean anything because it's a literary term that's supposed to mean Muslim, but it doesn't really mean Muslim
Yeah.
because they conflate all of these things. And it's a racist construction in the text itself. So we'll just refer to those troops of Saladin as the Muslim troops of Saladin. But he does order the slaughter of 3,000 people.
And he does it in public. He
Yes, he
does it in
does.
public to shame Saladin,
Yeah,
blaming Saladin for his failure to pay. Now, the thing about it is, Richard has no shame about this massacre.
yeah,
This is accepted as again, a military necessity, and it's blamed on Saladin. So what does Richard do? He's marching down the coast. He's doing what's called a fighting march. His army is marching in a very, very large rectangular formation. Foot soldiers are on the outside, heavily armored foot soldiers. They have um, they have both pikemen and they have crossbowmen marching. In the vanguard and the rear guard are the military orders, the Hospitallers and the Templars, who are the best troops that Richard has, the most professional troops. Richard's baggage train and Richard's knights on their horses are within the rectangle because the whole point of the march and the formation is that the horses and the baggage train are going to be protected.
Right.
Essentially, the foot soldiers are walls.
Right.
This
They're
is a
expendable.
movable castle.
Right.
And what Richard knows, because he's been told by the crusading orders, is that the bows that Saladin's Turkish troops have are not powerful enough for the arrows to really pierce the chain mail. And there is a description of Richard's foot soldiers as looking, and this is from the Muslim side, that they look like porcupines because they're marching with arrows sticking out from their armor. Richard has given an order that there is to be no breaking of the ranks to respond to the attacks. And what Richard does is he goes slowly. The march averages 4 miles a day, and he goes from city to city, stopping in the city, taking the city, getting reinforcements by sea, taking out wounded and replacing them in the line, and getting supplies, including fresh water, by sea. And finally, as he's approaching the city of Jaffa, finally, in the field of Arsuf, the, I believe it's Hospitallers in the rear, have taken so many casualties and have lost so many horses that they lose it. And the marshal of the Hospitallers refusing to take any more losses, and it's the worst place to be because basically you're having to constantly turn around to face the attacks, orders a charge. Richard was prepared for a possible battle by having three trumpeters who would signal an attack if a battle was to occur. When Richard realized that against his orders the Hospitallers had charged, he had the trumpets blown and the line of march turned into a line of battle. And by that point, Saladin's troops had grown so careless in coming so close to the lines that even though their mounts were faster, their mounts were more maneuverable than the heavy cavalry that Richard had, they were so close in that Richard was able to strike them, win a impressive victory at Arsuf. But here's the kicker. Instead of trying to pursue the survivors of the battle, including Saladin, Richard ordered his troops to return to the march and to go to Jaffa, where the march ended.
Right.
19 days, 81 miles, and that was it. In that battle at Barsuf, Richard fought in the front lines. Unlike modern commanders, medieval commanders were expected, if a battle happened, to fight in the front because it was a question of morale, it was a question of an example, and it was honorable.
Well, of course. And I mean, this even goes back to the pre-conquest period. And I talked about this in my last episode about the Vikings. The Battle of Malden, Beerthnaut, the fact that all of the debates about whether or not Beerthnaut should have allowed the Viking raiders to cross the ford or not. The point is that he said, we've got to fight this battle. We've got to fight the Vikings here. And he is on the front lines until one contingent breaks away and the rest of the men thinks it's Beerthnaut running away. And when they think that, what happens is that the morale in the ranks start to break because they think their leaders have left them. It is not what happens, and Beerthnaut ends up getting killed. And the battle is marginally successful. We don't know because we don't have the rest of the poem. But
It's a disaster.
it's a disaster. But this idea of paying attention to where the leader is, and of course, it's just one of many of the disasters that leads to the ultimate disaster of Æthelred, who you've written a whole book about him, of Æthelred losing eventually to Knut of Denmark in 1016. So this idea, though, that people have of, oh, the valiant king or the valiant lord, the valiant leader, you know, putting himself forward or not putting himself forward is, yes, accurate, but also we have developed these images in our head of medieval warfare as knights on horses, maybe some infantry guys, lots of arrows. Thank you, all the Robin Hood movies, lots of archers. Where is the reality, though, in the actual practice of medieval warfare?
In the actual practice of medieval warfare, knights are important. If a battle occurs, knights are important, although every medieval army of the High Middle Ages that I can think of, the number of foot soldiers to the number of horsemen, at the very least 6 to 1, at the very least 6 to 1.
That had to be.
And and you need the foot soldiers because the foot soldiers are the experts at sieges. The foot soldiers are going to be the ones who are the most important. They're the most important element of the army in a number of ways, including in battles. They're essential in battles. The cavalry, and we don't really even shouldn't even speak about cavalry because knights will fight on foot as well
Yes.
as on horseback.
Yes.
No, it's not really cavalry versus infantry. The knights have the advantage of being heavily armored. They have the advantage often of being on horseback. And in battles, what they will do is they will serve as the pursuit force. They will be a striking force. But like I said, that type of battle is extremely rare.
Right.
And knights who charge disciplined infantry are in for an unpleasant experience. If you have disciplined pikemen, the way that the Flemish were disciplined in the
Mhm.
Battle of the Golden Spurs, and this is the early 14th century, what the charging knights will discover is that their horses are charging into a forest of pikes
Right.
that are being held against the ground. And horses are not as stupid as people. People will charge into machine gun fire as they did coming out of the trenches in World War One. But when horses are faced with pointy objects facing them, they will swerve to the side or they will stop, which is what happened when the French fought the Flemings in the Battle of the Golden Spurs at Courtrai. They just stopped. And the result was really a slaughter of the knights on horseback.
Because they were
Uh,
literally sitting ducks in that
yeah,
sense.
they were shooting ducks. And the thing about the Flemings was they not only had pikes, they had all of these really nifty weapons that were like halberds, which were designed to have hooks on them to pull knights off of the horses or to hamstring the horse. And then they would have axes and they would have a point that they could slam down on a knight on the ground.
Right.
It was a bloody mess, and it was an example of why you don't charge into disciplined infantry. Now, if the infantry isn't disciplined, it's a different story.
Right. Because
And
you have to hold the line. I mean, I have
and
actually fought with pole weapons. I've fought with halberds and,
have you really?
yes. I,
You've done pole armed warfare?
we did this as part of my HEMA group in Richmond. We actually trained with pole arms. They were not sharp, obviously, so that but the heads were the halberd heads and bill hooks, and the whole process of drilling in lines and being able to be a line. And you have the advantages is about 6 feet of pole, if not 7 feet of pole in front of you. You have to be able to wield it. But when you've got that sharpened head, whether it's the billhook head or the halberd head, or the pikes, the actual pike blade, you can do an awful lot of damage and not get anywhere near the knight with a sword, in the sense of you've got plenty of distance between you. But if you are undisciplined, I can imagine that, of course, the cavalry is just going to run right over you.
Yes, exactly. Now, along with the very few battles. And I think that John Gillingham didn't really take into account this as well as he ought to. John is a fantastic historian. I mean, he is the individual who has transformed our study of medieval warfare,
Yes.
but he didn't take into several things. For John, John basically said that the type of warfare that predominated in the High Middle Ages, the science of warfare, as he calls it, he didn't call it the art, he called it the science of warfare, because he really believed that this is something that was studied, that the main military theorist was not a medieval figure at all, but was a late Roman military manualist by the name of Vegetius. Now,
Okay.
Vegetius, who was writing about the year 400 AD or CE, Vegetius was not a general. Vegetius was a military manualist. His De Re Militari, which is, by the way, the name of the academic scholarly medieval history society I
Yes, I
belong
know
to,
several members. Yes.
De Re Militari. His De Re Militari became the handbook of warfare in the Middle Ages. We know that because of the number of manuscripts that were copied. There are almost as many copies of De Re Militari as there are of scripture. It's just remarkable. Now, most of it is not really terribly relevant. How to build a camp is not terribly relevant, but it's the aphorisms of Vegetius that are. And Vegetius basically preached the doctrine of attrition. Fire and famine are deadlier than the sword, and that was what he was saying. Good generals avoid battles because battles are risky,
Right.
especially if your commander is fighting from the front. And for this, look at 1066, the Battle of Hastings.
Yes.
A close run affair until Harold was killed.
Arrow through the eye and possibly an axe to the
Maybe,
head. We're
maybe.
not sure.
We're not sure.
We're not sure.
Or Battle of Malden.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, the
Fear's
Elderman
not.
dies, and you have then people
Chaos.
fleeing the battlefield.
Right.
In some senses, medieval battles are very much like chess games. And chess was one of, we think of these knights as being basically thugs on horseback or maybe jocks on horseback. And it sometimes is a little bit surprising for people to discover that in the 12th century, medieval version of video games for the aristocracy was chess.
Right.
They loved chess.
It's all
And
about
if you think about
strategy.
chess is a war game.
Yes. 100%.
You have your foot soldiers or pawns, and you have your elite troops behind the foot soldiers, right?
Right.
But how does a chess game end? With the capture or
Of the
death
king.
of the king.
And I will point out, and this actually comes up in a lot of medieval literary sources, because when you see people playing chess in a medieval literary text, that is a signal that they understand the import of military strategy. And very often it is a man and a woman playing chess together. The queen is, in fact, the most powerful piece on the board. She is held in reserve, but she is the
Yes.
most powerful piece on the board.
And you don't want to lose your queen.
You do not.
So, okay. So how did Vegetius say the warfare should be fought? It should be fought with ravaging, and it should be fought with taking fortified strongholds. And that's exactly how medieval warfare was fought. And it's because, and Gillingham's right, it's not just because some Roman manualist wrote it, it's because it made sense. The military topography of Western Europe was dotted with castles and fortified towns.
Mm-hmm.
If you invaded a territory, if you won a battle, it didn't necessarily mean that you gained any territory as
You took
long
down.
as those castles and those towns were still held by the defenders.
Right. And that's why
So,
when you see things like the Hundred Years' War, it's not a war that lasts. Well, I mean, it's more than 100 years because it's
yeah.
1337 to 1453, but it's a series of large siege battles. It large sieges, Crécy and siege and a battle. You have Poitiers, siege and a battle,
Yeah.
and it's over the course of years. You might go years without any warfare at all, without any actual skirmishes or military engagement, even though technically speaking, the war was still going on because of the English dynastic interest in
And
France.
during that time, you'd have the free companies doing their own version because you, as soon as they're no longer being paid, mercenaries will become freebooters.
Yes.
They're armed men, and they will take the castles for themselves, which is what happened during the Hundred Years' War. Um, so, what is the general strategy, the military science that Gillingham proposed, which he called Vegetian, and which we see in the study of military leaders, including William the Conqueror, William Marshall,
Yeah.
the great exemplar of chivalry, and Richard the Lionheart. It's basically this: if you're doing an offensive campaign, the offensive campaign is to cross into the enemy borders and begin to burn as widely as possible, burn their fields, pull down their mills, destroy the villages. Um, Killing peasants, probably not, but you either kill the cattle or you round them up because you're feeding your own. You don't have supply lines, so
Right.
you're quote unquote living off the land, which is foraging, which is pillaging.
Yeah.
So this is what you're doing, and you're spreading out and doing it. And once you have created as much economic havoc as possible, you then settle down and systematically take their major fortifications one after another.
Right.
Okay, so how do you defend? What you do is you have a shadow army, not probably even as large as the invading army. And the shadow army is not there to force the invading army into a battle. It's there to pick off those those foragers who are going out to do the pillaging and the burning. You have those companies running off to do it, and they never come back because they're picked off by the shadow army. And the shadow army is also there in case the invader makes a real mistake and gets into a position where he can't retreat, and then maybe a battle will occur. But the bulk of the defenders are garrisoning the major towns and the major castles. And what are they doing? They're waiting for the attackers to run out of food.
Right.
So they have to retreat.
It's a waiting game on both sides because depending on
Exactly.
how fortified a town is, how much supplies they have, if they have clean water wells in the castle, because on all the tours I've done with Kelly DeVries and Bob Wisdom Savage on castles throughout England, and some of the castles I've seen in the Dordogne Valley with my friend Alain Collier, you really have to see what's in your castle structure. Whether you have in this fortified area wells that can provide clean water, do you have your food stores? Have you brought your food stores in? Which is why the invading army raises all of the crops and everything to make sure nobody can gather anything. There is
Exactly.
either they take the food for themselves, but they want to make sure that you don't have it because it's a waiting game. And people have this idea of, well, you can breach a castle. It's hard to breach a castle. It's
It is
really
hard.
hard to breach a castle. Most castles are never actually breached, despite the catapults, despite the trebuchets. And I mean, if you go down the Dordogne River and you see all of those castles like Castle Node, and you see the multitude of trebuchets, they're impressive, but they're meant to hit the ships on the river. They're not, they're meant to strike back at the armies outside of the city or outside of the castle itself because those walls are so thick that you're unlikely to do any kind of damage to the walls themselves. Now, you might be able to throw shit over the walls and you might be able to kill some people on the other side, but you're unlikely to actually destroy the castle itself. And the sliding of the walls, that's something Cromwell did, was sliding the exterior walls, not the actual keep walls, none of the Bailey walls, but the actual perimeter walls. You could slide that and work your way in. Conisbury Castle in Yorkshire, that's one where Cromwell slided the exterior wall and then said, it's fine. It's no longer defensive, so we're not going to bother to destroy the rest of the castle. So it's a beautiful 12th century castle that is actually intact for the most part. The actual central keep is intact, but they just slided the walls to make it indefensible. And that's all they needed to do.
And and it's not until the invention of artillery, gunpowder artillery, that the castles become truly vulnerable. And the result of that is the creation of a new type of fortification, the tres italienne, which is not going to be having stone walls, but is going to be having brick and earthen walls that'll absorb the cannonballs rather than shatter when the
Right.
cannonballs hit them. Now, here's an example again of the mentality of warfare, which I think is really interesting. When Richard came back from Crusade, and of course, Richard, that's the Robin Hood story. Richard comes back from Crusade and spends enough time in England to have a beer or two, and then goes.
Yes, but that's completely literary fiction and doesn't even occur in the medieval literary fiction, but that's a different issue.
So, what does Richard do? He immediately goes to Normandy because Philip Augustus has been taking Norman castles in
Right.
Richard's absence with the cooperation of John, who basically says, I'll take England, you can have Normandy, we're going to be happy. Richard is going to fight again. So in 1198, Richard fights what is not a battle because John Gillingham doesn't count it as a battle. It's at a place called Gisors. It's at Gisors, and it's a it basically is a siege. Philip is besieging Gisors. I'm sorry, Richard is besieging Gisors. Philip has a relief army coming to Gisors, and it's a typical siege, a typical response to a siege. A relief army comes and all that type of stuff. What Richard does is he creates an ambush. He knows that Philip is going to have to go over a bridge, and that's going to narrow things down. And so Richard hides his troops, and as the French come by, they spring the ambush. So Richard writes home, and this is not a private letter.
Yeah.
This is to the Bishop of Durham, and it's meant to be a public circular letter. And we know about this because Roger
Survives.
Howden, who is Richard's chronicler, is also a member of his court, and he basically has all access to all the letters and all of the official documents. And here's the letter he writes. You are to know that on the last Lord's Day before the feast of St. Michael, we entered the territory of the King of France at Danjou and made an assault on Courcelles, of which we took the castle with the town. On hearing of this, the King of France came from Mont with 300 knights and with men-at-arms and townsmen for the purpose of succoring the castle of Courcelles, as he did not believe that it was taken. On this, as soon as we learned that he was approaching, we went forth with a small number of troops, but sent the main body of our forces to line the bank of the river Epte, as we supposed that he would come upon our people on the opposite bank of the river from the side of Danjou. He, however, with his forces, made a descent in the direction of Gisors, on which we put him and his people, after taking to flight, into such consternation on their way to the gate of Gisors that the bridge broke down beneath them, and the King of France, as we have heard say, had to drink of the river, and several knights, about 20 in number, were drowned. 3 knights also, we ourselves unhorsed with a single lance, and have them as our prisoners. Okay, after explaining this, Richard closed the letter with this: Thus we have defeated the king of France at Gisors, but it is not we who have done the same, but rather God, and are right by our means. And in so doing, we have put our life in peril and our kingdom, contrary to the advice of all our people. These things we signify to you, that you may share in a joy as to the same. Now, that is so rich for a cultural historian, that letter. Uh,
Propaganda. Yay, us and
it's
God.
let's unpack that a bit.
Yes, please.
So what we have is Richard saying at the end of it, I was advised not to do this.
And did it anyway.
I did it anyway. I was advised because the science of war was avoid engagements. They're too risky.
Right.
And the reason they're risky is he said, I put my own life and my kingdom in danger by doing this.
Of
And why
course.
did he do this? He trusted in God and his right.
Mm.
Now, that it may sound it may sound like hyperbole, or it may sound like you could be easily cynical about it.
Yes.
But
But they
it's an
believed
a
it. Yeah.
but it is a religious age, and it
Yes.
is an age in which you have things like trial by combat, which makes no legal sense whatsoever unless you really do believe that God would not permit an innocent party to be killed, right?
Except that
Except they
as
actually
we
do
all
get killed.
know,
We
that
all know.
trial by combat, with the idea that whomever is the winner of that battle is thus blessed and sanctioned by God as the innocent one, because that God, as you say, God would never allow the
Never
innocent person to
permit.
be
Yeah,
killed. But we also know that there are an awful lot of medieval literary texts that kind of go bullshit.
absolutely. But you get the Song of Roland, and the point in the Song of Roland is that uh, Thierry, who is the champion for Charlemagne, is not one of the great knights. He's described as a smallish knight, and he's fighting against Pinnable, who is this massive, strong knight. How can he defeat Pinnable? There's only one way. God intervenes. Now, Richard, we may say it's bull, and it's written to a bishop of Durham, but it is intended to make the point that Richard believes in his right to the French throne, well, to Normandy. He
Right.
believes in that right,
Well,
and that
and that is the important point, is that it is that assertion of right. And of course he believed it, because this is, the
yes,
divine rights of kings to rule. And whether, his personal faith was that strong in any other way is debatable, but his belief in his own sanction by God certainly is. I was just going to say about Song of Roland, though, I have published on Song of Roland, and the fact that in many ways it is satirical because of its exaggerations, because of the ridiculousness. I mean, Charlemagne is 200 years old at the end of it. It is not meant to be taken literally. It and
really,
Oh yeah,
I
and
thought he was 200 years old.
did you? Yes, of course, because Charlemagne was totally 200 years
He
old
looked
and
old.
completely immortal, totally immortal. But that's just it, is that so many of the literary sources where people take that as the actual model of medieval warfare, and they're like, oh my gosh, you
Yeah.
could slice all the way through. You could not. If somebody was wearing armor and you had a horse, you cannot slice from the top of someone's head through to their horse.
But you know what?
Like I said, I checked. You
But
can't. And that kind of brings me to this moment of medieval warfare, the impressions of it by modern audiences, and how people seek to justify modern atrocity by looking at the past. And as you say, in the interpretation of Henry V's battle in World War II, Olivier didn't want to go there because he didn't want any sense that they would be capable of that same kind of atrocity. How do you see the modern conflicts and the modern violence in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Iran, all of this warfare rhetoric? How do you see that as, in some ways, either a misinterpretation or an inheritance, if it even is, of modern misconceptions of medieval warfare.
I think that, and again, Hegseth, I think, is an example of this. I've I used to argue at the Naval Academy teaching medieval warfare against the ideal of the warrior.
Right.
I taught pre-modern warfare, so I would teach the Iliad, I would teach hoplite warfare and all that as well. And the point that I made is that there is a real difference between a warrior and a soldier. Warriors are for individual glory. Warriors are undisciplined. You don't want Achilles in your hoplite phalanx. He will break rank.
Because he will not give a shit about anybody, and he will do what he wants to do because he's Achilles.
And because he's Achilles and he's only interested in individual honor. He's not interested in mission accomplishment, and he's not interested in the orders that are given by superiors. He's not interested in even the welfare of his comrades, except if he has a personal relationship, like with
You could
Patroclus,
argue the
right?
same thing is true about Lancelot. You could very much argue the same thing is true about
Yeah.
Lancelot.
So soldiers are disciplined. Soldiers fight in ranks. Soldiers are what we are trying to get our midshipmen, in the case sailors or Marines, or what we're trying the cadets at the military academy. This is what we're trying to get them to be, soldiers, not getting them to
Warriors.
be warriors. We want them to be disciplined. But having said all of that, Hegseth's warrior is just irrelevant to what warfare is now. And what warfare is now doesn't really allow you to be a warrior because the type of warfare that we have now is all based on technology. I was always wondered what a what a Spartan hoplite would have thought of the type of warfare fought by the US with fighter planes and bombers, which pretty much are invulnerable to ground fire, bombing and destroying the enemy without risking their own safety and lives. To kill the enemy from afar and to kill enemy that you don't ever see
That's the
is
point.
a much different type of warfare than the warfare that was fought in the pre-modern period, where warfare was up close and personal and you were risking your life and you were taking a life and having then to live with what you've done.
And where your leaders were on the battlefield with you.
And the leaders were on the battlefield with you. It's completely different. If you're looking at where the real revolution in warfare came, the real revolution in warfare is late 19th, early 20th century. That's where warfare really did change. And the type of warfare that we're fighting now is different from the type of warfare that was fought then. Now, what is similar about that, and this is where, and I think that most people don't think about this, is as I started, medieval warfare was largely about ravaging and sieges, taking towns. If a town surrendered, it would be looted, it would be pillaged, but it wouldn't be a massacre. If the town was taken by assault, and this is the reason why Henry V gives that, um,
Threat at our fur.
like I
Yeah.
said, blood-curdling threats, is that discipline was literally released. Your soldiers who have been sitting around this town maybe for weeks and months are now have the opportunity to do whatever the hell they please, and the populations get massacred. It's horrible. It's what happens in Ireland with Wexford.
Yeah.
It's what it's a terrible, horrible thing, but it's what's expected. It's the standard operating procedure in warfare, and it's the reason why if relief is not going to come, the prudent thing is to surrender
So that
your town
you're not opening yourself up to the potential for massacre.
for the potential. Warfare in the High Middle Ages is much more like Sherman's march to the sea in the Civil War than it's like Gettysburg or any of the battles. It is warfare of attrition, and the real victims of the war are the civilian populations. Modern warfare, as in Gaza, looks a lot like that because urban warfare, you may be targeting quote unquote military targets, but military targets are not separate from civilian living areas. And so, and urban, it's not only in Gaza, it's the type of warfare that we fought in Iraq. It's a type of warfare that we fought in Kabul. Anywhere you have urban warfare, you're basically having civilian warfare as well. And it's nothing new. It's the firebombing of Dresden. It's the firebombing of Tokyo.
Right. And of course
It,
we hear the explanation and the justification. I mean, even the recent bombings in Lebanon where the Israeli government officials, when they were confronted, and I heard this on both BBC and NPR, the same guy on NPR saying, well, yes, we did kill 300 people, but 200 of those people were Hezbollah. And then on BBC, same thing. He said, no, but 250 of those people were Hezbollah. And I'm like, how do you know? You don't, because
yeah,
they don't wear signs on the top of their head that says we are Hezbollah.
and that's part of the problem of asymmetrical warfare is that you don't know who the enemy really is.
Right.
And like I said, urban warfare itself is a is going to be a horrific event. Urban warfare, and especially in a place like Gaza where it is so heavily, densely populated that it's going to be impossible. And modern warfare doesn't distinguish between military and civilian because modern warfare is about industrial production and the destruction of industry. It's what happens in Ukraine. We're not going to see the type of warfare of the early modern period, in which was really pretty much the Napoleonic Wars, were pretty much battles of armies against armies.
Right.
It's now battles of nations against nations with the civilians taking massive casualties. It's
Right.
the nature of both modern warfare, and strangely enough, it's the nature of much of medieval warfare as well.
Well, and the problem with this constant cycle of warfare, particularly in the modern era, when we talk about conflicts, and you and I've discussed this before, the motivations for some of these conflicts, like Northern Ireland, is very similar to Israel and Palestine, and
Yes.
that debate, because it's a question of land. Who has it, who wants it, who feels they are entitled to it for whatever reason, and usually religion is the excuse for it, but not really the underlying thing that they want. It's the land. And the debate about, well, if you do this, we're going to do this, and the tit for tat, it is almost like a blood feud from the pre-conquest era.
Oh, I think very much like a blood feud.
It
And
is.
that's true. And that's true of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a blood feud. Uh, the majority of Israelis now are not Ashkenazi Eastern European. The majority of Israelis are descended from the Jewish populations in Muslim countries that were driven out in 48 to 52.
That would be the Sephardic
And
Jewish
and
communities.
they are and the population, the Palestinian population, they have the same grievances against each other. And just as it's taken, what, 300 years? I'm not going to blame your Norman ancestors, Miss Tracy,
Thank
for
you.
what they did in Ireland, as horrible as it was.
You
But
can go ahead.
let's just blame the Puritans in the 17th century and Cromwell and Ireton for what they did,
Mm,
maybe killing as many as a million
yeah.
Irish when they did
Cromwell
that,
was a disaster. Cromwell was just a monstrous human being in so
and
many respects.
resettling the North with
Yeah.
Protestants.
The
Why is
plantation.
Londonderry? The city of
Dairy.
London buys dairy. That's
Yeah.
why it's Londonderry. Um, this is not easily forgotten.
No.
The sins of the father are passed down to the sons and the daughters.
Right.
And that is why things like rational solutions to the Israeli Palestinian and to the Irish problems are not really easily accomplished
Right.
because we're not talking about reason, we're talking about emotions, and we're talking about deep seated historical grievances that are not easily forgotten. Um, in the case of American warfare, because we do have a vision. And this is, I think, the big American culture, a vision of America as America the good, America as the city on the hill, America as being a beacon to other nations. And as we approach our 250th anniversary, this has been built into the mythos of this country. Um, and it's a mythos which I think is very powerful and which means that when we engage in wars, we have to justify it. Um, it wasn't enough for George W. Bush, to justify the Iraq War by citing oil or by saying, he tried to kill my dad, I'm going to get him now.
Right.
He had to justify that by something else. And
Holy war.
so it's freeing the Iraqi people. We're not fighting against the Iraqi people. We're fighting against the evil Saddam. And we justify Afghanistan by 9/11. We justify all of these events by saying they're righteous. In that, we are very much like the Romans. The Romans had a just war um, ideology passed on through Cicero to Augustine to Christian just war ideology. And the Romans, if you read Roman writers like Caesar, they never fought an aggressive war. They were always defending either an ally or avenging an insult against the
Right.
Roman people, but they never were. They gained an empire by accident.
Right. Well, and the
We
interesting part of that, though, is the rhetoric then that the George Bush administration used of crusade. I mean, we see the word crusade come into the modern American discourse in the lead up to the Afghanistan war, but especially Iraq, because Iraq really couldn't be justified by 9/11.
absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, it was the only thing that the Ayatollah Khomeini and George Bush agreed on was that this was a crusade.
Right.
And and when Bush said it, what he meant of crusade as a righteous endeavor, like the crusade against drugs or the crusade against poverty, this was the U.S. doing a righteous thing. And when Khomeini heard it, what he said was, "Yeah, those are Christians trying to do a new crusade against us." Uh, to his credit, George W. dropped the crusading rhetoric after it was pointed out to him this is not useful. But who has picked it up?
Hegseth and his ilk.
Hegseth.
And
And it's
that
written
was my
all
next.
over Hegseth's body. He
Right.
has the tattoos to show it. Deus Vult, God wills it, the cry of the Crusaders, a Jerusalem cross.
Sorry, I'm
You know, people,
twitching.
yeah,
Yes.
people said this is white Christian nationalism, but it is the crusading ideology, and Hegseth isn't shy about it.
No.
He sees this as a crusade.
Yes. And it is white supremacist. It is modern white supremacist, white Christian nationalist ideology that sees everything he's doing in terms of his own religious framework. And I mean, since you brought up the family history of the Normans and the Tracys, I mean, you grew up yourself. You were explaining to me that, growing up in a Jewish community in New York, the different approach to Zionism and the different approach once upon a time and how these terms have shifted. And as you say, George Bush changed the rhetoric. when he recognized it wasn't serving his purpose, and also when he was like, oh, that's not what I meant.
Yeah,
The rhetoric and the language of nationalism, of Zionism, of Christian nationalism, of all of these things has shifted and has become again this question of who's righteous and who is not. And now we have drones, and now we can just blow people up without even knowing who's there.
exactly. Exactly. It's it's a different type of warfare. It's an unheroic type of warfare. Drone warfare is the future. It's not even the future, it's the present.
Mm.
And it's a warfare of technology and the improvement of technology. And soon the drones and our weapon systems are going to be controlled by AI. And it's an interesting thing. I was talking to one of my former military colleagues about that, and it was in response to a question that has been asked to Claude AI about, and this was really asked in an interesting fashion. Claude was asked, how does Claude feel? The term was feel. How does he feel about AIs being used as to as part of targeting systems in weaponry and for warfare? And Claude responded that basically, I feel terrible about it. He responded that this is not what I was made for. We shouldn't be used for this. This should be done by humans. And it was like a really interesting response. It shows that the programming is almost like Isaac Asimov's three laws of robotics. Never harm a human, that type of
Right.
thing. Um, I'm sure Grok would have answered, I love it. But.
And that's kind of part of the difference, is because Claude is anthropic. I mean,
uh,
and isn't it? Yeah, Claude is anthropic AI,
yes,
and Grok is, of course, Elon Musk. But
must.
you know,
Yeah.
how do you think though that this? How do you think this is going to play out, especially with
And this
this
is where the
conflict and
military,
what Netanyahu's doing to the entire? He's not making Israel safer. He's not making anybody safer. He's trying to stay out of prison. What do you think of all of this in terms of even
it
warfare
makes
strategy or just human beings?
it makes life much more dangerous. For one thing, the AI will be used for targeting, and it's because of the quick decision making. And especially if the opponents are using it in order to counter it, people are slow. AI is fast. In terms of tactical decision making, AI is going to replace human tactical decision making. Strategic, hopefully never. Tactical, very much so. But drone warfare has another problem to it. And the drone warfare's problem is that drones are really cheap to make,
Right. Anybody
and
can
you
do
don't
it.
need states to make them,
Right.
and they're expensive to intercept. So we're looking at a world in which, and one of the reasons why AI is going to be adopted tactically is that the only way we're going to intercept drones is
Is
if
out there
the
drones.
AIs are the ones who are responding to drones, not if humans sitting at a console are responding to drones. Warfare is going to change, and this brings us back to the thing of culture. This doesn't have to do with culture. This has to do with technology. It has to do with survival. It has to do with the practicalities of warfare. Um, in times of peace, people, and this was something that Thucydides, as far back as Thucydides, in times of peace, people can live up to their highest ideals. In times of war, we're stripped to the necessities.
So, on that note, I will
Yeah.
ask one final question. What can the modern world learn from understanding the reality of medieval warfare?
What can we learn? We can learn that trebuchets were pretty effective. we can look. we can learn,
It's a hard
you know,
question, isn't it?
this is the basic problem I had teaching midshipmen, because the Naval Academy a is a pre-professional school. It's not that much different than a seminary. Instead of priests and instead of yeah, priests, what we're producing are military officers that relevance, they want relevance. And as I would say to them, you're never going to lead a medieval chivalric cavalry charge, and you're not going to be operating trebuchets. Hopefully, you're not going to be operating trebuchets, and you're not going to be manning galleys and all of that type of stuff. So,
I
what
had an
can you
image, sorry,
learn?
of trebuchets on an aircraft carrier. Sorry.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, you're going to be on a 5,000 person aircraft carrier and you're going to be manning the Coke machine. No, what can you learn? And I think this was the important thing to learn is that you have to understand that the people that you serve with and the people that you fight against may have completely different worldviews than you do. That you have to be able to be flexible enough to appreciate it. You have to understand that what you consider to be rational, reasonable behavior may not be the rational and reasonable behavior of an enemy. That the worldview of someone who you think of as insane, as a suicide bomber, may be inspired by religious views that you yourself think you hold, but you don't hold as deeply as that individual who is willing to die and kill you for them. And this is important, that warfare is not going to be a activity which is black and white. You're going to be operating always in gray areas with incomplete information, and you're going to have to make judgments based upon that incomplete information. That was true throughout the Middle Ages, where communication was always limited on a battlefield or off the battlefield. And even though the communications are excellent now, it's still the case that you're going to have to do this. And that's why I think it was really important to study something like medieval warfare, is because it taught critical thinking. It taught you to be cautious even about eyewitness accounts.
Of course.
And it teaches you about how different the ideas of warfare and the understanding of the world in general was from the way you may think about warfare and what is righteous and what is shameful. A medieval knight would think it was completely shameful to kill an a disarmed, helpless noble lying at his feet. At the same time, that same knight would have had no difficulty burning down a cottage in a village, perhaps with the people inside it, and slaughtering a bunch of foot soldiers. And the foot soldiers would have had no problems with killing the knights because they knew that there was no way they were going to be able to keep them for ransom because he would be taken away by some of their own nobles to be held for ransom. This is the type of world that the medieval soldiers fought in, a world where you had to be flexible and you had to understand both your comrades and the enemy. And that's the world that they're going to be in. So, anyway, that's what I would say one learns from studying medieval warfare.
And of course, those who do not study history are condemned to repeat it. So,
Yeah, the problem with this is that history is so based on contingency and everything is so complicated, nothing ever occurs the same way.
of course not. It's the mindset of, wait a minute, I've seen this before.
Four, yes.
But Richard, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. And I would
And you
like
will come back to my podcast.
absolutely, I most definitely will. And we will have another conversation, and we may need a whole nother episode to discuss more aspects because, as you say, medieval warfare is not one thing, and it is,
Maybe we should have one just simply on massacres.
I that would be good. A massacre
And
episode would be
head
fantastic.
taking, because that is your thing.
We can do massacres and head takings. But thank you so much, Richard Abels, for joining us today. And I am Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.